J.D. Vance offers US aid, but Ibrahim Traoré rejects and replaced with rice. Everyone's stunned. The chandeliers cast a superior glow over the embassy ballroom, where Western diplomats in tailored suits mingled with practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. Among them, Ibrahim Traoré stood like an island of stillness. His military uniform was simple but impeccably pressed, lacking the ostentatious medals and decorations that adorned the chests of other visiting dignitaries. At 34, he was the youngest head of state in the room, and by far the least impressed by its opulence. President Traoré drawled a red-faced American diplomat, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. "You must be thrilled about tomorrow's announcement. It's not every day a country like Burkina Faso gets this kind of attention from Washington." Ibrahim's dark eyes registered the condescension without betraying emotion. He had heard variations of this sentiment since landing in the capital. The implication clear: be grateful for whatever scraps fall from the table of empire. Around him, conversations quieted as people strained to hear his response, expecting effusive gratitude or nervous deference. "My people's attention is what concerns me," Ibrahim replied, his voice quiet yet somehow filling the sudden silence. "Their needs have been overlooked for generations." The American's smile faltered, unsure if he'd been subtly rebuked. Before he could recover, an aide appeared at Ibrahim's shoulder, whispering that a secure call awaited him. As Ibrahim excused himself, he caught fragments of conversation in his wake. "These military leaders never understand diplomacy. How long do you think this one will last before a coup? Vance has his work cut out. Convincing them to accept our terms." Ibrahim allowed himself the smallest smile as he exited. "Let them underestimate him. Tomorrow would change everything." Before we continue, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Ibrahim Traoré had come from dirt roads and mango trees, from a village where children studied by lamplight because electricity remained a luxury. These memories flashed through his mind as he stared at the encrypted message on his secure phone. His past felt both distant and immediate. The son of farmers who had joined the military to serve his country, not knowing he would one day lead it through its darkest days. "They're bringing a film crew tomorrow," reported Colonel Ouattara, his most trusted advisor. "American news networks. They want the perfect photo-op of a grateful African leader accepting American salvation." The presidential suite offered a panoramic view of the capital, where strings of lights competed with darkness, power outages, a daily reality. In the streets below, soldiers patrolled against terrorist threats that had spilled over from neighboring countries, problems that had persisted despite or perhaps because of decades of Western intervention. "And Secretary Vance?" Ibrahim asked, his voice carrying the weight of decisions not yet revealed. "Arrived an hour ago. His team has requested you wear traditional dress for the ceremony, more authentic for their cameras." Ibrahim didn't respond to the insulting suggestion. Instead, he picked up a weathered folder containing documents that would never make the American news. Reports of how previous aid packages had enriched foreign contractors while leaving little for actual development. Statistics showing how loan conditions had crippled their economy. Evidence of how Western mining companies extracted billions in resources while paying pennies in taxes. "Our Chinese and Russian contacts confirm they are ready?" Ibrahim asked, his gaze still fixed on the city lights blinking in and out of existence. "Yes. And the other ECUS members who've signed on to rice. Everything is prepared, exactly as you planned." Ouattara hesitated. "But sir, the consequences will be severe," Ibrahim finished. "But for whom?" His phone buzzed with a message. An American diplomat forwarding the speech they drafted for him to read tomorrow, thanking the United States for its generosity. Ibrahim scrolled through the obsequious text with a tight jaw. He thought back to his childhood home, where his father had gathered in the village to hear news on a battery-powered radio. How they'd listened to Sankara speak of a Burkina Faso that stood on its own feet, a dream assassinated too soon, but not forgotten. "We've lived with their consequences for centuries," Ibrahim said finally. "Perhaps it's time they lived with ours." He turned to face his advisor, eyes alight with quiet determination. Contact our friends at the African Development Bank and make sure President Jiang understands the timeline has accelerated. There will be no going back from this, Ouattara warned, loyalty warring with concern. Ibrahim moved to his desk and pulled out a simple military cap, running his thumb over the national insignia. When the colonizers first came, they offered our ancestors beads and called it generosity, while taking everything of value. Some things change, Colonel, some do not. As the night deepened, Ibrahim prepared not for capitulation but confrontation. In 12 hours, Secretary Vance would offer billions in aid with hidden strings attached, and Ibrahim Traoré, the underestimated soldier from a forgotten village, would shock the world with his answer. Tomorrow, he told Ouattara, as the man prepared to leave, we show them what true partnership looks like. Dawn broke over Ouagadougou with a merciless sun that seemed to forge the air into something tangible. At the Grand Hotel, the American delegation buzzed with activity. Junior staffers ironed flags and rehearsed camera angles while security personnel with earpieces prowled the perimeter. Inside the presidential suite, J.D. Vance adjusted his tie before a mirror, rehearsing key phrases in broken French. Remember, his chief advisor reminded him. Emphasize the generosity angle. The networks are running with America's hand of friendship. We need visuals of gratitude. Vance nodded, reviewing briefing notes on Burkina Faso, a country he'd scarcely thought about before taking office. The intelligence summary described Ibrahim Traoré as pragmatic, malleable, with the right incentives. The economic attaché had assured him this would be straightforward. A country battling terrorism and poverty couldn't afford to refuse $12 billion in assistance. And his confirmed attendance? Vance asked, glancing at his watch. Yes, sir. Though he's running behind schedule, some issue with his transportation. What neither man knew was that Ibrahim's transportation issue was actually a carefully orchestrated meeting taking place at a nondescript government building across town. There, representatives from Russia, China, and 7 African nations sat around a table with the architectural plans for RICE, Regional Integrated Cooperative Economy, spread before them. The Americans suspect nothing, confirmed Miriam Sankara, the brilliant 29-year-old economist who had conceptualized much of the framework. One of the few women in Ibrahim's inner circle, she had earned her position through intellect rather than connection. Their satellite surveillance shows nothing unusual because they're watching the wrong places. Ibrahim studied the faces around him. Allies who had spent months in secret negotiations. Once we announce RICE, we will have minutes, not hours, before Washington responds. Every signature must be ready. Every statement coordinated. My president reaffirms China's commitment to the initial funding package, stated the Chinese representative calmly. Without the exploitative terms the IMF would demand, the Russian diplomat nodded. And our military cooperation agreement is prepared, as discussed. Back at the hotel, preparations continued. Western journalists practiced their stand-ups, reciting statistics about terrorist attacks and poverty rates, framing the narrative of a desperate nation about to be saved by American intervention. A CNN correspondent adjusted her scarf, speaking into the camera. A historic day for U.S.-African relations, as the troubled nation of Burkina Faso prepares to accept what experts call a lifeline of American support. In his office, Finance Minister Tebsoba was sweating, and not just from the heat. As one of the few cabinet members not privy to Ibrahim's full plan, he paced nervously before the president's aide. This is madness, he hissed. We cannot afford to antagonize the Americans. The World Bank will freeze everything. The IMF will recall our loans. We will be economic pariahs. Perhaps, replied Colonel Ouattara coolly. We already are. How has decades of their help improved our situation? The average citizen remains as poor as in colonial times. At the village of Zorgo, 90 minutes from the capital, Ibrahim made an unscheduled stop. No cameras followed him, as he walked among farmers, whose millet fields struggled in the changing climate. An elder woman gripped his hands, speaking rapidly in Mossi. She says her grandson joined the army to fight the jihadist. Translated a local official, She fears he will die protecting French mining interests while her village lacks medicine. Ibrahim knelt before her. Tell her that after today, Burkina Faso will chart its own path. Not as puppets, but as partners with those who respect us. As Ibrahim's convoy finally approached the capital, his phone buzzed constantly. Reports from security indicated American intelligence officers moving with unusual urgency. They had intercepted fragments of communication, but dismissed them as irrelevant. After all, what alternative could a poor African nation possibly have to American assistance? At the Kazim Palace, where the ceremony would soon take place, Alassane Ouedraogo, a junior foreign ministry official who had helped coordinate parts of Ibrahim's plan, watched American security checking the room for threats. They examined the physical space thoroughly, but remained blind to the geopolitical maneuver about to unfold within it. "Everything ready, Mr. Ouedraogo?" asked a condescending American agent. "Oh yes," Alassane replied with a carefully measured smile. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The agent missed the gleam in the young diplomat's eyes, just as Washington had missed the midnight meetings, the secure communications, and the quiet revolution of competence that had been building for months under their radar. While American intelligence focused on terrorist threats in the Sahel, they had overlooked the economic and political architects working quietly in government offices. As Ibrahim's convoy neared the palace, Vance received a troubling message from an aide. Unusual diplomatic movement detected. The Chinese ambassador arrived at the Ministry of Mines. Russian military attaché seen at defense headquarters. Probably nothing, decided his chief of staff. Last-minute negotiations for mining concessions. They always try to undercut us before these announcements. Vance frowned, but nodded. They were 20 minutes from a historic photo opportunity that would boost his administration's foreign policy credentials. Nothing could derail that now. Ibrahim stepped from his vehicle, straightening his uniform. No traditional dress, no performative gratitude. A group of university students had gathered beyond the security perimeter, watching silently. Among them, a young woman held a handmade sign partially visible behind the police line. It quoted Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated decades earlier. "He who feeds you controls you." Ibrahim nodded almost imperceptibly in her direction. Then, with steady steps, he walked into the palace, where the international press waited to record what they believed would be Africa's latest acquiescence to Western power. Behind him came his delegation. Not just military officers, but economists, engineers, and diplomats who had worked in shadow for months. And as the doors of the Great Hall swung open, revealing the American delegation standing with practiced smiles and prepared speeches, Ibrahim Traoré allowed himself a moment of perfect clarity. Power didn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of alternatives. The Grand Hall of Kazim Palace had been transformed into a theater of Western munificence. American flags flanked the Burkinabe ones in careful symmetry, while a massive screen displayed infographics of the proposed aid package. Journalists jostled for position, their cameras focused on the central podium, where history would supposedly be made. The air conditioning hummed aggressively against the African heat, creating an artificial chill that seemed to emanate from the American delegation itself. J.D. Vance approached the microphone with the confident stride of a man accustomed to delivering good news. His tailored suit and practiced smile projected an image of benevolent authority as cameras clicked in rapid succession. "Today marks a new chapter in the relationship between the United States and Burkina Faso," he began, his voice carrying through speakers positioned throughout the room. "A partnership built on shared values and mutual respect." He gestured toward Ibrahim Traoré, who sat expressionless in the front row. "In recognition of President Traoré's commitment to regional stability, I am pleased to announce an unprecedented $12 billion assistance package that will transform infrastructure, security, and economic development across Burkina Faso." The journalists scribbled furiously as Vance detailed the components. $5 billion for counter-terrorism operations, $4 billion in infrastructure loans, $2 billion in agricultural development, and $1 billion in direct budgetary support. Behind the eloquent phrases lurked unspoken conditions. Military bases, exclusive mining rights, and structural adjustments that would open markets to American corporations. This generous package, Vance continued, emphasizing the word generous for the cameras, comes with America's full commitment to Burkina Faso's sovereignty and development. As Vance spoke, Ibrahim observed the room with keen attention. The Western journalists looked bored, already writing stories about grateful Africans. The American officials wore expressions of self-satisfaction. Only his own team knew what was coming. They sat with the stillness of predators before an ambush. And now, Vance concluded, turning toward Ibrahim, I invite President Traoré to accept this historic offer on behalf of the people of Burkina Faso. The room erupted in diplomatic applause as Ibrahim rose from his seat. He walked unhurriedly to the podium, acknowledging Vance with a handshake firm enough to momentarily disrupt the American's confident smile. The room fell silent as Ibrahim adjusted the microphone, the small gesture somehow reclaiming the space as his own. Secretary Vance, Ibrahim began, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable strength. Distinguished guests, people of Burkina Faso, who may be watching. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the expectant faces. I stand before you today as a son of this land, a soldier who has sworn to protect not just our territory, but our dignity. The American delegation shifted slightly, something in Ibrahim's tone triggering the first whisper of unease. For centuries, our relationship with Western powers has followed a familiar pattern. You offer what you call generosity, we surrender what you call concessions. Ibrahim's gaze was unwavering. Today that pattern ends. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Cameras that had been lowering snapped back up. Ibrahim nodded to Colonel Ouattara, who opened the doors at the rear of the hall. Through them walked a delegation that caused audible gasps. Officials bearing the flags of Russia, China, and several African nations. Burkina Faso respectively declines the United States assistance package, Ibrahim stated, each word falling like a stone into still water. J.D. Vance's face transformed from confusion to disbelief, as cameras swiveled frantically between him and the Burkinabe president. An aide rushed to Vance's side, whispering urgently in his ear, but the damage was already spreading across global newswires. Instead, Ibrahim continued, his voice gaining strength. We announced today the formation of RICE, the Regional Integrated Cooperative Economy, a partnership between equals, not between master and servant. The Chinese representative stepped forward, unfolding documents on the table that had been prepared for signing the American aid package. The Russian diplomat followed, along with representatives from Mali, Niger, Ghana, and other African nations. Each movement was choreographed to maximize the visual impact for the world's media. RICE will begin with an investment of $15 billion, Ibrahim explained, as the journalists scrambled to recalibrate their narratives. With no political conditions, no military occupation requirements, and no structural adjustments that hurt our people, African resources will develop African nations, with technical assistance from partners who treat us with respect. Vance surged forward, his diplomatic composure fracturing. President Traoré, perhaps we should discuss this privately before making hasty announcements. There is nothing hasty about this decision, Secretary Vance, Ibrahim replied, calm against the Americans' growing agitation. It comes after decades of watching aid that creates dependency rather than development. After centuries of extraction disguised as assistance, the hall had transformed into controlled chaos. Western journalists were frantically filing updates, while African reporters wore expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. Security personnel from both delegations had moved to higher alert, creating a physical tension that mirrored the diplomatic one. The United States cannot guarantee your security if you proceed with this arrangement, Vance said quietly, all pretense of partnership abandoned. Ibrahim smiled for the first time that day. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Secretary Vance, but perhaps I misunderstood. The statement hung in the air between them, captured by dozens of microphones. Vance's jaw tightened as he realized the trap denying it would acknowledge the coercive nature of American foreign policy confirming it would validate everything Ibrahim was suggesting. Ibrahim turned back to the assembled press. For too long, Africa has been treated as a chessboard where great powers play their games. Today, we choose to be players, not pieces. He gestured to the young economist Mariam Sankara, who stepped forward with a comprehensive dossier. Ms. Sankara will now present the details of rice and how it will transform not just Burkina Faso, but the entire region. As Mariam began her presentation, articulate, data-driven, and undeniably impressive, Ibrahim watched something shift in the room. The Western journalists who had arrived expecting to document gratitude were now witnessing defiance. The African reporters who had come expecting routine diplomacy were now recording revolution. Most telling was the reaction from the junior staffers and younger diplomats on the American side. Behind their professional masks, Ibrahim detected flickers of reluctant admiration, even understanding they had grown up in a world where American exceptionalism was being challenged on multiple fronts. Some part of them recognized the legitimacy of what they were witnessing, even as their superiors seethed. When Mariam concluded, Ibrahim returned to the microphone. We extend an invitation to the United States to engage with rice as an equal partner, should they wish to participate in Africa's future, rather than control it. The offer, at once generous and cutting, was met with stunned silence from the American delegation. Vance, ashen-faced, conferred urgently with his team. As the signing ceremony for rice began, each pen stroke on the founding documents was accompanied by camera flashes, recording a moment that would be analyzed in diplomatic academies for decades to come. As Ibrahim signed the final document, he looked directly into the cameras. Thomas Sankara once said, "He who does not feed you can demand nothing from you." Today, Burkina Faso chooses to feed itself. The words traveled instantly across continents and oceans, reaching villages where people gathered around radios and urban centers where citizens watched on phones and televisions. In that moment, Ibrahim Traoré transformed from an obscure military leader to a symbol of African resistance, of new possibilities, of dignity reclaimed. And as the American delegation retreated in disarray, hastily arranging emergency calls to Washington, Ibrahim stood among his new partners with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been underestimated for the very last time. The aftermath came in waves. First, the immediate shock, diplomatic cars speeding away from Qassim Palace, encrypted calls to capitals across the world, and news alerts flashing on screens globally. Burkina Faso rejects US aid, forms alliance with Russia and China. Markets trembled as analysts scrambled to understand the implications of the new economic bloc forming in West Africa. In Washington, emergency meetings convened. The president's national security team huddled in the Situation Room, where satellite images of Ouagadougou were projected on screens as if searching for physical evidence of the diplomatic earthquake that had just occurred. J.D. Vance faced brutal questioning about his failure to anticipate the move. "How did we miss this?" demanded the Secretary of Defense, throwing a preliminary intelligence assessment onto the table. "An entire alternative economic structure developed under our noses. They compartmentalized information." Vance defended himself, voice tight with contained fury. "Our assets were focused on counter-terrorism, not economic policy. And frankly, no one imagined they had the capacity to coordinate something this sophisticated." The unspoken truth hung in the air. They had underestimated African leadership, assuming dependency where they should have recognized determination. In European capitals, former colonial powers watched with alarm as other African nations began making inquiries about joining rice. When the Ghanaian president publicly praised Ibrahim's courageous stand for African dignity, emergency calls were placed to offer improved trade terms and development packages. 3 days after the announcement, Ibrahim sat in his office with Alassane Ouattara, the young diplomat who had helped coordinate the rice negotiations. The world outside was still in upheaval, but inside there was a calm focus. "The Americans have frozen our assets in their banks," Alassane reported, reviewing the latest intelligence. "They're threatening sanctions through the UN Security Council, though China and Russia will obviously veto. Western media is divided, some calling you a reckless dictator, others begrudgingly acknowledging the logic of our position. Ibrahim nodded, unsurprised. And our people? Alassane face brightened. The public response has been overwhelming, sir. Spontaneous celebrations in Barbadulaso and Higuya. Students are organizing solidarity marches. Even opposition leaders have issued statements of support. On his desk sat reports from villages like the one Ibrahim had visited before the announcement. Local leaders described a surge of hope, unlike anything seen in generations. Not naive optimism, but a fierce belief that perhaps finally their resources might benefit their own children. Your promotion papers, Ibrahim said, sliding a folder across the desk to Alassane. Effective immediately, you will serve as our first ambassador to the Rice Council. You helped build this. You should help guide it. The young man's eyes widened in disbelief. Sir, there are more experienced diplomats. With more colonial thinking, Ibrahim interrupted gently. We need fresh minds, Alassane. People who see Africa's future, not its past. As Alassane left, visibly moved by the trust placed in him, Ibrahim turned to the window where he could see the first physical manifestation of Rice, Chinese engineers meeting with local contractors to begin work on a solar power plant that would reduce the capital's chronic electricity shortages. Unlike previous foreign projects, this one came with technology transfer provisions and training programs for Burkinabe workers. His secure phone rang. President Adama of Sierra Leone, the fifth African leader to call that day with interest in joining the initiative. Across the Atlantic, Vance was fighting for his political survival. In a tense press conference, American journalists who had witnessed the Ouagadougou announcement asked increasingly uncomfortable questions. Secretary Vance, critics are saying this represents a fundamental failure to understand changing power dynamics in Africa. How do you respond? Vance's carefully prepared answers about reckless alignment with authoritarian powers sounded hollow even to his own ears. The narrative was slipping beyond his control, especially when leaked documents revealed that the rejected aid package had indeed contained provisions giving American companies preferential access to Burkina Faso's rich gold and manganese deposits. In Burkina Faso's rural heartland, Ibrahim made an unannounced visit to a village school. Children in worn uniforms surrounded his vehicle, curious rather than fearful of the soldiers who accompanied him. Inside the simple building, a teacher was conducting a mathematics lesson despite having no textbooks or proper supplies. Within 6 months, Ibrahim promised her, this school will have new books, computers, and solar power, not as charity, but as investment in our future. We have heard such promises before, the teacher replied with respectful skepticism. This time, Ibrahim answered, we are writing our own promises, not receiving them from others. As weeks passed, the initial crisis atmosphere evolved into a new reality. Western nations that had immediately threatened economic isolation gradually softened their stance, unwilling to cede an entire region to Russian and Chinese influence. The European Union, especially, began quiet outreach about potential cooperation with Rice, on terms that acknowledged African priorities. In a striking development that shocked many international observers, several former US diplomats published an op-ed arguing that Ibrahim's approach might actually promote greater stability than decades of Western intervention had achieved. By creating regional economic interdependence, they wrote, Rice addresses root causes of conflict that military solutions cannot solve. 1 month after the announcement, Ibrahim stood on a dusty airstrip in eastern Burkina Faso, watching as the first shipment of Russian agricultural equipment was unloaded. Beside him, local farmers examined the drought-resistant seed varieties that came with it, developed for similar Sahel conditions in Central Asia. The Americans would have given us more impressive machines, observed an elderly farmer, running his weathered hand over a simple irrigation pump. Perhaps, Ibrahim acknowledged, but these we can repair ourselves, with parts manufactured in Niger, and no American advisor will live in your village, telling you what to plant. The old man nodded slowly, understanding the difference. That evening, Ibrahim received word that Mali and Mauritania had formally applied to join Rice, bringing membership to 9 nations. The economic zone now encompassed nearly 200 million people and some of the continent's richest mineral deposits. What had seemed like a defiant gesture was rapidly becoming an alternative model of development. In a secure conference room, Ibrahim met with his economic team to review the transition plans. The early days would be difficult. Currencies needed stabilization, trade protocols required standardization, and security cooperation was still fragile. But for the first time, these challenges would be addressed through African frameworks, not external prescriptions. Washington has requested a private meeting, Colonel Traoré informed him. Not Vance. They're sending the Deputy Secretary of State. Apparently they wish to reset the relationship. Ibrahim allowed himself a small smile. Tell them we would be pleased to discuss any proposal that recognizes our sovereignty and treats us as equals. Nothing less. As night fell over Ouagadougou, lights flickered on across the city, still unreliable, still insufficient, but now connected to a path forward that belonged to the people themselves. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as another transient military leader, had rewritten the rules of a game rigged against his country for centuries. And in capitals across the world, diplomats and statesmen were beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the international order, not through military might or economic dominance, but through the simple revolutionary power of offering an alternative. 6 months transformed Ouagadougou in ways both subtle and profound. The Rice Summit venue, a gleaming conference center built with Chinese engineering and African labor, stood as physical testament to the new reality. Flying above it were the flags of 17 nations, each representing a population that had chosen cooperation over dependency. Inside, delegations moved through halls adorned with artwork celebrating African innovation rather than traditional motifs aimed at Western tourists. Ibrahim Traoré entered without fanfare, his uniform still lacking the decorations his counterparts often favored. What had changed was how people responded to his presence, not with the cautious deference shown to temporary power, but with the deeper respect accorded to those who have altered history's course. President Traoré greeted the newly appointed U.S. Special Envoy to Rice, extending her hand. "Thank you for accommodating our delegation on such short notice." The American presence itself represented a seismic shift in Washington's approach. After months of failed pressure tactics and increasingly isolated opposition, the U.S. had reluctantly accepted Rice's permanence. This first official delegation marked their tentative engagement with the new order. "We welcome constructive dialogue with all global partners," Ibrahim replied, embracing diplomatic language that now served his terms rather than others. Around them swirled evidence of Rice's early impacts. Regional trade had increased by 22%. The new currency stabilization mechanism had withstood speculative attacks from international markets. Most importantly, the first infrastructure projects were already operational. Rural solar grids providing electricity to villages that had never known it. Irrigation systems revitalizing abandoned farmland, and technical schools teaching skills aligned with development priorities. Ambassador Hassan Ouagadougou approached, now carrying himself with the confidence his position required. At 34, he had become the face of the new African diplomacy, pragmatic, unapologetic, and fluent in the language of international relations, while refusing to be bound by its old hierarchies. "The Brazilian delegation has arrived," he informed Ibrahim, "and India has officially requested observer status in our next session." The expansion beyond the original partnership had surprised even Rice's architects. As emerging powers sought alternatives to Western-dominated institutions, the African initiative had become an unexpected model. Ibrahim nodded acknowledgement, remembering the skepticism that had greeted their initial announcement. In a quiet moment before the summit's opening ceremony, Ibrahim visited a small exhibition documenting the journey. Photos showed the dramatic rejection of the American aid package, the emergency meetings that followed, and the first tangible projects now changing lives across the region. Most poignant was an image of village children attending a new school built through Rice's education initiative, their faces capturing the promise that had driven him from the beginning. "They said it wouldn't last 3 months, came a familiar voice. Ibrahim turned to find Finance Minister Topsoba, once the greatest skeptic of his plan, now one of its most committed advocates. The World Bank predicted economic collapse. Tapsoba continued, studying the timeline display. The IMF forecasted currency failure. Western media prepared obituaries for our ill-conceived experiment. He gestured around them, at the undeniable evidence of progress. They were wrong about everything. Not everything, Ibrahim corrected gently. They were right about the difficulties. Every step has been harder than we anticipated. This was true. The early months had brought genuine hardship, as Western corporations withdrew investments and traditional markets temporarily closed. Security challenges had intensified as terrorist groups, sensing opportunity in the transition, increased their attacks. There had been moments when even Ibrahim's closest allies questioned whether they could withstand the pressure. What had sustained them was unexpected resilience. From ordinary citizens, when fuel prices spiked during the transition to new supply chains, people carpooled without complaint. When certain imported goods became scarce, local alternatives emerged. The shared purpose of building something truly African had unleashed creativity and determination that no economic model had predicted. "Mr. President," called an aide, "it's time." The Grand Hall fell silent as Ibrahim took the podium. Before him sat not just African leaders, but representatives from across the global South, Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, all watching the rice experiment with increasing interest. 6 months ago, Ibrahim began, his voice carrying through perfect acoustics. "We made a choice that many called impossible. We chose partnership over patronage, cooperation over dependency, and dignity over dollars." He paused, surveying the room where former skeptics now listened intently. "The road has not been easy. There were nights when I questioned whether we had asked too much of our people too quickly. But each morning brought new evidence that when respected as equals, there is no challenge Africans cannot meet." In the audience, J.D. Vance listened with careful neutrality. His return to Burkina Faso now as part of a diminished delegation seeking engagement rather than offering rescue represented American pragmatism adapting to changed circumstances. The administration had quietly replaced him as Secretary of State, making him the diplomatic scapegoat for a larger failure of imagination. Today, Ibrahim continued, "We sign agreements that expand Rice's mandate to include joint defense protocols, expanded currency cooperation, and unified resource negotiation. No longer will our nations be played against each other by those seeking the cheapest access to our wealth. No longer will our security depend on foreign bases that serve foreign interests." Ibrahim's gaze found Mariam Sankara, the economist whose vision had provided Rice's foundation. She sat among delegates now, respected internationally, for crafting policies that withstood the harshest global pressures. Her journey from a government analyst, dismissed by Western advisors, to an architect of regional transformation, embodied everything Rice represented. 6 months ago, many in this room were enemies or competitors. Ibrahim acknowledged. Colonial borders and foreign interests had turned neighbor against neighbor for generations. Today we begin dismantling those artificial divisions, not through idealistic proclamations, but through practical cooperation that benefits our people directly. The summit chamber erupted in applause. Even the American delegation joined politely, pragmatism, overtaking pride. In the back of the room, Ibrahim spotted the village elder he had spoken with months earlier, invited as a representative of rural communities. The old man's eyes shone with tears as he witnessed promises kept rather than broken. Minister Tapsoba rose to present the economic data figures that had silenced international critics. Regional agricultural production had increased 15% through coordinated planning. Infant mortality had decreased in areas with new medical facilities. Most significantly, the percentage of resource wealth remaining within member countries had nearly doubled. These numbers represent not just economic indicators, Tapsoba explained. His former skepticism now transformed into passionate advocacy, but liberation from cycles of exploitation that have defined our existence since colonial times. After the formal proceedings, Ibrahim walked through the Ouagadougou streets with Alassane, now his trusted advisor and Rice's diplomatic face. Solar-powered streetlights illuminated their path. A small but meaningful change in daily life. Children played soccer under the glow. their game undisturbed by the power outages that had once been inevitable. The Americans have submitted their proposal for observer status, Alassane reported, on our terms, not theirs. Ibrahim nodded, satisfaction in his subtle smile, and Secretary Vance returned to Washington this morning. His replacement seems more willing to accept the new reality. They paused at a community center where a mural depicted the moment Ibrahim had rejected the American aid package. Already that instant had become mythologized, a David and Goliath narrative that simplified the complex calculations and quiet preparations that had made it possible. We must be careful with victory, Ibrahim cautioned. The moment we become arrogant is the moment we begin to fail. Alassane nodded, understanding the wisdom. The Chinese representatives are pushing for preferential treatment in the new mineral development protocols, and they shall receive exactly the same terms as everyone else. Ibrahim replied firmly. Rice is not about replacing one master with another. They continued toward the presidential palace, where the work would continue long into the night. The path ahead remained fraught with challenges, coordination between nations with different priorities, security threats that crossed borders, and the inevitable pressure from global powers seeking advantage. Yet something fundamental had changed, not just in policy but in possibility. In his office later that night, Ibrahim removed his formal jacket and stood at the window overlooking the city he had transformed. On his desk sat a simple frame containing a photograph of his parents, farmers who had never imagined their son would reshape geopolitics. Beside it lay a tattered book of Thomas Sankora's speeches that had guided him since youth. The secure phone rang. Another crisis requiring attention, another negotiation needing guidance. The work of true independence never ended, but as Ibrahim reached for the receiver, he carried the quiet certainty that had sustained him through the most difficult days. That dignity once reclaimed created its own momentum. Mr. President, came the voice of his aide. The delegation from Niger has requested emergency consultation on the drought response coordination. I'll be right there, Ibrahim replied, already refocusing on the endless tasks ahead. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou spread like stars across the landscape, still flickering occasionally, still imperfect, but increasingly powered by African hands building African solutions. In homes and shops beneath those lights, citizens who had expected little from their leaders now spoke of possibilities their parents had never dared imagine. And in diplomatic academies across the world, instructors were already updating their curricula to include a case study that would be taught for generations. How Ibrahim Traoré, underestimated by everyone, had changed the rules of a game rigged against him, not through violence or rhetoric, but through the quiet revolutionary power of creating an alternative. Did this story touch your heart? Has something similar ever happened to you or someone you know? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you enjoyed this journey of transformation and discovery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the truth about human connection, dignity, and the unexpected moments that change lives forever. Every like, comment, and share helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments.